So what are Russia and Ukraine up to again? Zelensky's troll ceasefire. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look together at what's happening on the Ukrainian battlefield, in the Ukrainian and Russian skies, and of course, what's going on behind the scenes of this whole war. We'll look at who is afraid of having their parade bombed and what it would mean if some people actually bombed a parade. In addition, of course, we'll take a look at which missiles and drones flew where and what kind of damage they caused. Spoiler alert, there were a lot of them again, and we'll also touch on economic issues, especially concerning Japan. So, if you want to know more, stay here until the very end, give a like, share, help us get more visibility, and of course, consider becoming a member on Hero or supporting us financially through the QR code. But now let's get to it. So what exactly is this so-called Zelensky's troll ceasefire, which comes with the claim that the Russians are begging? I would start by saying that the Russians are begging. That's Volodymyr Zelensky's interpretation of this whole situation, where basically the Russians want to have their parade on Red Square on the 9th of May, celebrating victory in the Great Patriotic War. And this victory would be very unpleasant if some drones flew in and bombed it. By the way, it would be a completely legitimate target because it would be an attack on soldiers, military equipment, and so on, which is a perfectly legitimate target regardless of whether it's at a parade or not. The problem is that even if there were no ceasefire and even if the Ukrainians could attack, it would be a huge mistake to attack a military parade celebrating the end of World War II. Politically, because it would look terrible from a PR perspective, it would look awful, and everyone could use it against Ukraine. Like, look, they're attacking the celebration of the end of World War II. World War II, they're desecrating the memory of those veterans. They're attacking the celebration of the defeat of fascism. That's what kind of Nazis they are. It's terrible. So Ukraine would never do this anyway, because it doesn't make any sense. It's the worst. That Ukraine might decide to actually attack the celebrations marking the end of World War II, World War, and kill some of the assembled soldiers there on Red Square, that's just complete nonsense. However, Zelensky is selling it very well, and he's selling it in such a way that Russia can't even hold a parade without asking Ukraine if it's allowed. Of course, that's just blatant trolling. Besides that, Zelensky takes the trolling even further and said, regarding the ceasefire, that he's fine with it. And in his opinion, the ceasefire could easily start on the 6th May and a ceasefire from May 6th forever. Russians, end the war. Let's make a permanent ceasefire. This is basically what Zelensky proposed. But he said that if the Russians continue attacking even after the 6th in May and keep attacking in the following days, they will respond in kind. If the Russians oppose a ceasefire, there likely won't be one and nothing can be done. But Zelensky sold it very well politically in the sense that he basically said, hey, you want a ceasefire on May 9th. And how about making the ceasefire start from May 6th and never canceling it? And the Russians basically either have to say no to that, and by doing so clearly, and once again confirm that they don't care about peace, that they don't care about a ceasefire, and that they're just playing along for the sake of celebrations, and that they're terrible hypocrites. And by doing so, clearly show that they are warmongers, which they are. But it seems that many people need to keep showing and proving it over and over again, and even then, it's often not enough. So the Russians have to make that point, which they will, and have already shown, because of course the war is still going on. The Russians don't respect any ceasefire from Ukraine and only wanted a ceasefire for their own show. But the whole thing is actually just a propaganda tirade because, of course, the Ukrainians know that the Russians only want a ceasefire for their own show, for their marching on the square. At the same time, both Ukrainians and Russians know that an attack on that parade is a terrible idea. And I would almost suspect some Russians and some Russian secret services of possibly staging an attack on the Russian military parade to show how terrible the Ukrainians are. In reality, to some extent, this could have value considering that Ukrainians are already regularly attacking Moscow, Russian oil refineries, and no one in Russia has any illusions anymore that Putin or Putin's army could protect them from Ukrainian drones, so they actually have nothing left to lose. The Russians have nothing to lose by staging or simulating a Ukrainian attack on that parade on Red Square. It's one of the fears that exists. It's one of the things that could happen because Ukrainians wouldn't gain anything by attacking. They already know they can penetrate Russian defenses. They already know they can strike Moscow. They already know that Russian air defenses aren't strong enough to protect Russia, so they have nothing left to prove by doing that. But what the Russians can prove by this is that Ukrainians simply have no respect for anything, that they are fascists, and that they attack commemorations and blah, 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 blah. So if there were an attack on Red Square on the 9th of May, personally, I think it's more likely that the Russians would attack there or stage an attack than that the Ukrainians would do it. Because the Russians have the ability to regain a certain lost credibility that people might feel and to gain some kind of national cohesion and unity around the flag, whereas the Ukrainians could only lose by doing that. So this is kind of a political propaganda-related curiosity. Now let's take a look at what's happening in the sky. If we look at what the Russians have sent to Ukraine over roughly the past week, it's about 1,100 drones and 22 missiles. In total, 17 people were killed and 56 people were injured over the past week. And it seems that quite a lot has been damaged, mainly gas infrastructure. Pumps were hit, for example, and and so on. Overall, however, it can be said that the Ukrainian air defense was relatively successful. The success rate of the air defense was around 70 to 80%. Of course, we can see that Russia is completely ignoring Ukraine's unilateral ceasefire, and the most damaged regions were Mykolaiv and Odessa. And as I said, even Kramatorsk was under attack, as well as Zaporizhia, and the attack was mainly targeted at gas and oil infrastructure. On the other hand, here we have more information about additional deaths from previous days. Overall, in the past week, about 17 people have been killed and 56 people were injured so badly that they had to be hospitalized. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians have also carried out their own actions and in the past week have sent about 556 drones to Russia. Again, they mainly targeted fuel and oil infrastructure. Again, they tried to hit mainly refineries, and for the most part, they were successful. At the same time, places like Moscow were also under attack.
Dronový útok na moskevský věžák.
It was basically a kind of propaganda cherry on top, like saying, yes, we are capable of attacking Moscow, but this is a message the Ukrainians have been sending for a while now. Because maybe you remember that even last year when there were attacks, a few days before the parade, Moscow was attacked as well.
Útočilo se
on Moscow's outskirts, those civilian targets. And the whole point was that the Ukrainians were trying to intimidate the Russians so that maybe people wouldn't go to the parade, so it would look embarrassing that there weren't any people there, and so on, so that Russia would be forced to significantly strengthen security measures for the parade, which would mean that, of course, the Ukrainians could attack somewhere else when you have to move security forces to Moscow for the parade and so on. So in this respect, this kind of propaganda attack also makes sense in that it might mean that the Russians will have to increase security measures around the parade. And even though the Ukrainians would never actually attack the parade itself, because that would be pointless, they can take advantage of the fact that the Russians might be pulling some air defenses from across the country, so they can attack where the Russians have withdrawn those air defenses. It's like scaring the Russians that you'll attack the parade, so they protect the parade, and in doing so, they expose something else, which is exactly the goal. Overall, if we're going to talk about casualties that have occurred, we have to mention that the Ukrainians killed around 8 people, civilians. There are some civilian casualties. And overall, the damage is mainly focused on the oil industry as always. But this time, there are also some casualties. So now let's take a look at the front itself. The most interesting news from the front itself is that in April, the Russians were not able to capture any additional territory. In other words, the Ukrainians took back more Russian-held territory than the Russians managed to capture from Ukraine. When we talk about Russian territory, of course, we mean Ukrainian territory that the Russians are holding. So once again, and more simply, the Ukrainians took back more territory than the Russians managed to take from them. But here it's a bit complicated because in recent months, counting who has gained which territory is not easy at all. So we know that the front line is extremely confusing and you can never really say who controls which territory. We can say that if we look, for example, at this section between Sloviansk and Konstantinivka, when we look at this section, we can say that somewhere around here, the Russians have the upper hand over the Ukrainians. There are probably also mostly Russians here, but at the same time, for example, we have information that in this little protrusion, one Russian was spotted, so they credit that area to the Russians. And here in Nikiforivka, the village, they say there are simply 3 Russians there. So they say, okay, this village is probably under Russian control. But in reality, it was never under Russian control because there are simply 3 soldiers there. And those soldiers might leave in a moment when they realize they have a bad position. And so the Ukrainians come and take the village back, and they present this recaptured village, which the Russians never really held, as a village they liberated from the Russians. And at that moment, you can sell it as propaganda, saying that you regained your territory that the Russians took from you before, so you actually got your land back, and you can subtract it from the territory the Russians really captured. This is basically a bit of a propaganda game that both Ukraine and Russia can play because the control of the land is so unclear. Basically, the point is that if we have, for example, a gray area here, then according to the deep state map, the gray area is no man's land that is being fought over. But at the moment when the Ukrainians come and reduce that gray area because they strengthen their position here in Novopavlivka, then they say, well, we've liberated this territory. What does it mean that they've liberated it? Does it mean they've driven the Russians out of there? No. Most of the time, it can mean, for example, that they've reduced Russian activity there, that there aren't as many drones anymore, and that the area is no longer considered no man's land, but is held more by Ukrainian soldiers. So the information that Ukrainian soldiers have liberated more territory than the Russians managed to capture of Ukrainian land is manipulative. It's manipulative. And you probably shouldn't take it as a sign that the Ukrainians are taking the initiative, starting to attack, and will soon liberate all of Ukraine. This definitely isn't the factor. But what we can take from this is that when the Ukrainians are able to say and calculate in this way that they've liberated more territory than they've lost, it actually indicates stagnation on the front. Because at some places, the Ukrainians take over the gray area, somewhere the Russians drive them out, and somewhere they drive out the Russians. So it's basically an exchange, zero sum, nothing gained, nothing lost. You sell it somehow, you spin it, you calculate it, you underline it. In the end, you could say the Ukrainians have liberated more territory than they've lost, but effectively what's happening on the front is stagnation. No one is making progress anywhere. That's what's happening on the front now. But what's a bit more interesting is that not only do the Ukrainians actually say they've managed to liberate more territory than they've managed to capture, we've already talked about how that could be possible, but another thing is that the Russians are losing more soldiers than they can recruit, which is a bit more interesting because it means the Russian army is effectively shrinking. It's not about losing 10,000 soldiers and recruiting 10,000 soldiers. So even if they lost 10,000 soldiers, they'd still have the same size army. No, it's about them losing, say, 40,000 soldiers and recruiting 35,000, so their total army decreases by 5,000. Of course, 5,000 isn't that much in this war, but you have to realize that those 5,000 will simply be missing somewhere. So someone will have to replace them. And since it won't be fully saturated, the value of each individual soldier increases. And we know that a Russian soldier has a relatively low value in terms of how they are treated. And when you add up a few months like this in a row, those 5,000 can suddenly become 20,000. And if you're missing 20,000 soldiers at the front, or if you lose 20,000 soldiers, that's something you will feel. And at the same time, it's important to say that the fewer soldiers you have there, the fewer attacks you'll be able to carry out, and the greater the chance that you won't capture anything or that something will be taken back from you somewhere. And at the same time, when you're missing soldiers somewhere, it adds up and means there's a greater chance that someone will kill a soldier there if there aren't enough soldiers to repel an attack, for example. So in this respect, it's very unpleasant for the Russian army, and mobilization is kind of looming. And that could be a state mobilization or an attack during the anniversary parade, which is Russia's third most important holiday. Maybe. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
Neříkám, že se to stane.
I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. We'll be watching it live, definitely, ladies and gentlemen. But otherwise, if we look at what's happening right now on the front, where the most intense fighting is, of course, the most intense fighting is in Konstantinivka, which is a city that's part of Ukraine's defensive belt. So far, the Russians have managed to penetrate the southern part of the city, but they haven't in any way broken through the defenses or caused the defenses to start collapsing. It's more of a slow, gradual gnawing away. Nothing that the Ukrainians can't handle. And it's definitely not possible to talk about any breakthrough or any crossing of the defensive line of that fortified belt. So basically, it's a battle stalemate. Where things are really intense is the level of the air war, because 500 drones from the Russians, no, 500 drones to Russia from the Ukrainians, 1,000 drones from the Russians to Ukraine, that's just a huge number, which, by the way, is another thing. The number of drones being sent is increasing more and more. Last month it was very balanced. The month before that, the Ukrainians actually sent more than the Russians, so there are really a huge number of drones, more and more. The air war is getting more and more intense, and big things are happening here. Big things are happening here. Of course, big things are also happening on the propaganda front, which is really active, it's really strong, and something interesting is also happening in the economy. The interesting thing happening in the economy, which is somewhat connected to Russia, is that Japan is resuming imports of Russian oil. Don't be mistaken, the fact that Japan is resuming imports of Russian oil is not in any way caused by Japan having better relations with Russia or that something shady is going on there. It's simply because Japan doesn't have raw materials. It doesn't have raw materials because of Hormuz, it's desperate, and so it's even reaching for Russian resources. Here we simply have the Sakhalin project, which is one of the few ways to get oil. It's one of the things or one of the places where there isn't any embargo on oil imports. And the reason is simply that Japan needs this, and without it, it wouldn't be able to function fully. It's the renewed import of oil, which is basically caused by the ill will of the American president. If it weren't for the stupidity of the American president, this would never have had to happen, and Japan would never have had to agree to this, and never would have had to humiliate itself like this in front of the Russians. The American president messed up the situation again. However, maybe it doesn't have to be permanent because, for example, there's increasing cooperation with Australia here, which theoretically could be able to
Výpadky z Ruska.
or at least partially compensate from Hormuz.
Japonsko nemuselo brát
So much from Russia.
Nicméně, ano,
In a good position, it's not a good situation for Japan at all. it's probably not appropriate to be angry at the Japanese for what they're doing. After all, it's a very rational, very pragmatic step driven by existential necessity. I definitely wouldn't consider it any kind of betrayal or collaboration. Some of you will say, why are the Russians delivering it to them? There must be some kind of collaboration agreement or something like that. But the problem here is that a lot of people who say that Russia shouldn't deliver anything to anyone and that they should just forget about everyone and that this would show us something, they forget that it's like if the Czech Republic decided to stop exporting Škoda cars and beer. Yeah, like if the Czech Republic stopped exporting Škoda cars and beer, then a lot of people wouldn't have anything to drink or drive. We'd really show them, but our economy would collapse. So that's how it is. I realize it's not a perfect comparison since the raw materials trade is different, but it's essentially the same idea. Russia is fundamentally dependent on exporting raw materials. It doesn't have a proper market, and it has a huge budget deficit. So it has to fill it wherever it can. That means that whoever asks Russia for raw materials will get raw materials. If they pay, of course. Anyway, look, we'll see how things develop. Right now, both the air war and the propaganda war are very interesting. Please write in the comments if you think the Russians will fake some kind of attack around the 9th May, or if you think the idea makes sense that the Ukrainians have no reason to attack the parade, but the Russians have a reason to attack the parade to mobilize the population. Or do you think the parade will go smoothly and the Ukrainians will just take advantage of the calm and the relocation of some air defenses to Moscow to attack somewhere else where the air defenses had to be withdrawn from? Write all of this to me, and of course also write your opinion on the situation at the front itself. I'm interested in everything, I read everything, and I get annoyed when it's nonsense, so that's how it is. Support the content if you like it. Like, share, spread the word, comment. You know you should do all that. See you next time, join the streams, and for now, take care. The stream continues, but the video ends here.